You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Forhad. Happy New Year to everyone. Hope you're all safe and well. Before we jump into this episode, I'd like to thank everyone again for your support. We are so grateful and proud of what we've been able to accomplish so far and are excited about what the future holds. In fact, we actually rebranded Investigation Insiders and shared on social media earlier this month, and the response has been fantastic. So thank you again. So we're going to start off the year with another very, very special guest, Jasmeet Ahuja, an attorney with the law firm Hogan Lovells. How are you, Jasmeet?
I am fantastic. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to what you have to say. So without getting into too much detail, Jasmeet and I met a couple of years ago while working on a matter together. Aside from our interest in solving problems for our clients, we also shared some other interesting things. The most obvious being that we were both from South Asia. Needless to say, we've kept in touch even after our work together ended, and I think very, very highly of her. Hopefully that's a good summary of how we know each other, Jasmine.
That is great, and I think very highly of you. So I'm glad you said that. It is exciting, frankly, as a South Asian woman to see a South Asian man running his own organization in a field similar to mine, and I've been lucky to work with you.
Same. So, the biggest compliment I could give to a litigator like yourself, by the way, is that I would not want to be on the opposite side. So, um, that's how highly I think of you. So, if it's okay, would you mind giving our audience a broad overview of your background?
Certainly. So as Farhad said, I work at Hogan Lovells. I'm a counsel. I'm a litigator. I focus on primarily data privacy and cybersecurity work, data breach class actions, other class actions. I'm also a general commercial litigator in both Pennsylvania and in New York. And my background is a bit different. So I worked in national security for almost a decade after the U.S. invaded Iraq. I was a big Iraq War protester in California. I was in graduate school at Stanford in engineering, and I had this grand idea about going to go work in the Pentagon. So I did that. And then almost a decade later, I realized I really wanted to go to law school. So I ended up going to law school, and I've been fortunate to be able to work in sort of an area that combines my expertise and my experience. So I work in, technology litigation at the heart, and oftentimes we're dealing with issues related to nation states or bad actors that relates to my former career. So that's my background, and I live out here in Pennsylvania, but as I said, I'm litigate in both New York and Pennsylvania.
Right, right. I guess let's learn a little bit more about you. So, where did you grow up? And you said you were a major, an engineering major. Why'd you choose law as a profession?
So I grew up in California. My parents had immigrated from India so that my father could go to graduate school at UC Berkeley. And his goal and his life goal was to really work in air pollution control. And as you can imagine, to this day, India still does not make that a focus. And so I ended up working for CARB, California Air Resources Board, and public service was really important to me. So I ended up studying at Stanford, my undergraduate school there, as well as I started a master's as well. In the midst of the master's, with the Iraq War, I ended up leaving California and moving to DC to go work in the Pentagon. I spent about a decade in DC before I came full circle and went to law school. My plan always was to go to law school. I always saw myself as an advocate at heart, thinking about trying to support others and advocate for others who couldn't advocate for themselves. And so somehow through that process, I've ended up at Hogan Lovells, which is a private law firm. But I've really loved my work. I would say, when you represent defendants, you're always, people say you're representing, the guys with the deep top pockets, and that might be the case. It might not always be the case, but I think Ken Frazier once said, and Ken Frazier was the first African American man to lead like a Fortune 500 company. He was the former CEO of Merck. He said the most important work he's ever done is his pro bono work, and I really think being a lawyer and being a litigator really allows you to do substantial pro bono work, and so that's probably what I love the most in my profession, as well as being just a counsel to my other clients as well.
Huh. Well, you just led into my next question, which is what do you like most about being a lawyer?
I like helping my clients navigate tough problems. The law is not always clear as much as people might wish it were. And so you're constantly navigating and saying, okay, what did we do, and what does the law say, and how to ensure that our clients operate within the law. Plaintiffs' bars are very powerful. There's a lot of powerful plaintiff lawyers, but at the same time, defendants are sued for items, there's whistleblower actions, there's other actions that just aren't fair. And so I think it's important that everyone gets a fair shake. And so I've really enjoyed working for my clients on, the billable side, so to speak. But I also like working for my clients, as I said, on the pro bono side, and supporting, individuals seeking individual rights, representing state governments in high profile immigration or gun regulation matters.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So, for people that maybe, for younger people that may be looking into getting into law, and doing what you do in the future, what are some things that you don't love about being a lawyer?
Billing. You bill your time. I would say that's probably what every lawyer will say is the least fun. Because at the end of the day, all you're trying to do is support your clients. You don't want to think that you're billing for them. So I would say that's the part I like least about being a lawyer. And I'd say the other part I like least is, as a mother of 3 kids, it's a service job. It's a service industry. So you must be available around the clock because your clients expect that of you, and you obviously want to support them. But it's hard. It's hard. It's hard to be a mother, be a law firm lawyer, and do sort of every other thing, extracurricular activity that you may do. I'm also the president of the South Asian Bar Association out here in Philadelphia. I'm also on the commission of the Human Relations Commission out here in Swarthmore. I'm on a variety of other boards, and you want to do so much in your time. So it's the time that it takes. And you always want to, when you're filing a brief, you want to ensure that the brief is the best it can be. And that takes time.
Yeah, no, I don't envy any of those things. And, you do a good job juggling all those things. And oh, by the way, that's the one other thing, Jasmeet and I have in common. Between she and I, we have a basketball team plus 2 bench players. So, so you spent time with the federal government, right? And the private sector. Do you have a memorable sort of story or anecdote that you can tell us that sort of, encompasses who you are, what you've done, or anything our listeners love stories?
Certainly. So when I was at the State Department, I helped oversee the F-16 sale to Pakistan, and I was in this job in my early 20s. And I remember I would travel to Pakistan for a while, almost every month, helping to oversee the F-16 program. And I would travel with about 20 enlisted personnel from the U.S. Air Force because we were trying to help. And it was, I'm this young person, but everyone sort of understood that an arms sale is a State Department function. Mm-hmm. And I think the respect for the government and respect for governmental processes is something admirable. I know it probably looked bizarre to my colleagues on the other side in Pakistan that this young woman in her 20s was the one dictating perhaps what is State Department policy or what is U.S. policy.
Right.
But what I loved about it is the respect for the institutions that exist. So, whether the U.S. government sells a particular type of arm to a country is a diplomatic decision, and therefore that is run by the State Department. And I loved my work, but I also loved just what it reflected for our country in terms of rule of law.
Well, that's pretty amazing. How long did you do that for?
I was at the State Department for a couple years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was a great team of individuals. I'm in awe of the people I worked with at the Air Force. I'm still in touch with some of them. I'm sure they saw me as probably a little sister because I was so much younger than many of them, but it was a very respectful relationship, and a relationship really built on respect of the institutions.
Sure. And you flew like on military planes going back and forth, or?
Sometimes, commercial. You can get anywhere in a commercial jet.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So, all right. So I guess let's dive into the topic of the show. So we ended last year by talking with John Franchi, who retired from the CIA. I asked him about what he thought were some of the biggest concerns for 2023 and going forward in our country. Not surprisingly, he mentioned cyber threats as one of those concerns, right? So I thought it'd be interesting to talk to you about some of the potential legal implications of having cyber incidents and what the difference is going to be when you're prepared and you're not prepared, right? And so we actually had another guest last year, Yalkin from Cyber Diligence. He talked about how the nuts and bolts of protecting your infrastructure. But what we're going to talk about today is, again, what the legal implications might be. So, Jasmeet, can you, in broad terms, talk about how big cyber threats are or cyber vulnerabilities are to the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, people think it's hyperbole to say it's at an all-time high, but I think given just the amount of data that is online and the increasing movement of data online, it is at an all-time high. What we witnessed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually a decrease in cyber attacks and ransomware attacks. I think everyone assumes that was a consequence of those threat actors focused on other issues and items, predominantly Ukraine.
Sure.
But over the course of, I'll say, since last summer, we've seen an uptick once again. And a lot of our clients, unfortunately, are being the victims to security incidents.
Mhm.
Now, there's a lot that companies can do right in responding, and there's a lot that companies can do wrong. And it's all about preparation.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about, hypothetical company A and B. A, where the company is prepared and takes the appropriate steps, and B, maybe where they're not as well prepared, and what that leads to, if you don't mind.
Certainly. So it's required now by a number of regulations as well, depending upon what industry you are, but having an incident response plan. So having some code of conduct that the company is supposed to follow in the face of an incident, and having individuals that are responsible for effectuating that. That having an incident response plan and having one that works, meaning there's a tabletop exercise conducted, depending upon your footprint online, quarterly, yearly, every other year, and ensuring that you have a process in place that works, I think is number one. Oftentimes what I've seen is sometimes some clients have these incident response plans that are like hundreds and hundreds of pages. They're more of a Bible than a plan. And, it's hard to know what to do. That's not helpful. Having an incident response plan that is solely on your network drive that then after a ransomware attack can't be accessed, well, that's not helpful to anyone.
Right.
So, having a response plan that you have at your fingerprints printed, that you know generally what to do in the face is critically important. Now, I'd be remiss to not say having outside counsel is critically important. The great thing about outside counsel, which is something I function in the face of security incidents, is having someone who's unemotional on the sidelines, able to really walk and support a client through an incident. It's going through a ransomware attack is the most stressful time. I mean, worse than litigation that a client's facing, because I never know if they're going to come out cleanly at the end. And being able to walk a client through what they needs to do, having a plan of action, ensuring that there's a narrative created, that people aren't sending emails left and right, blaming or whatever, keeping a very tight sort of narrative and timeline so that you can get through the incident as quickly as possible is just so important. So outside counsels often function as quarterback, just making sure everyone's doing their job. Comms are, legal is, the business people are running, everyone's sort of like, on track, on point, so they can get out of it as quickly as possible. With, importantly, the least liability, right? I mean, that's the goal, is to limit liability. And so that's why you have outside counsel. But to the earlier point of having an incident response plan, at your fingertips and not necessarily just on your hard drive, having an outside counsel, number programmed to your cell phone, or knowing who to contact even, is so critical, right? Yeah. You don't want to, at the time of an incident, be like, oh no, who do I talk to about this, and start Googling. Like, that's not good. And I'll tell you, incidents generally happen at the worst events, right? So they happen on Christmas, they happen on Easter, they happen on Mother's Day, right? The days that you don't want to be online dealing with any work is when you'll be working 24 hours a day. And so knowing who to contact is critically important. That's sort of how to be prepared, I'd say.
So let's talk about what you've seen when companies don't do that, when they don't have an incident. Like you're talking about, you said like it's required depending on the industry. So what does that mean? Like if you're not required, you have an incident, what are the potential consequences to the leadership if that does occur?
So the worst is I entered a meeting once where there were, I think, 83 people on a Zoom. There's no way in that event that you're going to come up with a good approach and everyone is going to be coordinated. You just can't coordinate among 83 people. Forhad, you and I can barely coordinate among our children, right? So the notion of coordinating amongst a large group is just not going to happen. So again, having a plan from the start, knowing who the 5 functions are, or the people responsible for the 5 functions, and who needs to do what is critically important, so that you have a small group who can then, each function then coordinates their body. So that's important to have identified from the start. Again, you don't want to be in a Zoom with 83 people. That is not a good plan. You also, one thing I didn't mention that is also, critically important and increasingly important, and there's a lot of discussions about it, is having cyber insurance and figuring out what your policy covers and doesn't cover. It's terrible when there's an incident and the risk manager looks at the policy and realizes, oh no, they didn't notify within so many hours as this policy requires, or oh no, they didn't hire the outside counsel that they were supposed to hire under the panel arrangement of the policy. Or oh no, it's just simply not covered. There's a whole exclusion, right? So being aware of what your policy says and having coverage is important, or making a decision given sort of the cost of coverage to not have coverage and self-insure, but having everyone be on the same page, right? It's the worst is when the head of risk looks at the policy, assumes it's covered, and then the CEO finds out it's not, right? It's all about being prepared in the event of the eventual incident.
Sure. And have you seen at all like where someone or a firm has not been prepared, or maybe egregiously unprepared? Have there been any legal consequences to, like, again, the leadership team? Has anyone chased them, civil suits, criminal, matters, anything like that you've seen?
I've seen people lose their jobs, absolutely.
Yep.
It's unfortunate, but I have seen people lose their jobs. I've seen insurers not cover,
Yep.
right? So if you
Yep.
don't follow a particular process, if you don't notify them and get in writing from the insurer approval for this particular vendor, and you
Right.
continue to use the vendor without approval, I've seen insurers say, I'm not paying that.
Yep.
And you can't blame the insurer, right? They specified a policy in a contract that was signed by both parties, and then the insurer didn't actually follow that. So it's just contract interpretation. They're not liable. So I've seen that happen. I try to always ask for the insurance policy right after an incident so we can ensure that we're following the policy to the T. Or better yet, I try to work with my clients in negotiating the policy and obtaining the policy, renewing the policy up front.
Yep.
There has been a significant increase in premiums of policies, particularly standalone cyber insurance policies, at the
Right.
same time as we've been witnessing contracting and coverage. So coverage insuring agreements have been contracting while premiums have gone up. So you're essentially, paying more for less. But, that's to be expected because for a while, insurance companies were just paying. They're paying ransom agreements. And most importantly, threat actors were known to look for insurance policies. So the threat actor would say, hey, I know you have an insurance policy that covers $1 million. So I am going to only ask for $1 million at a minimum. I
Right.
know you can pay that.
Right.
So, understandably, insurers were deciding to not cover or finding ways to limit coverage. In addition to being faced at the same time as we saw an increase in ransomware attacks, obviously COVID hit, and the insurance industry was being hit with, COVID-19 coverage and business interruption coverage claims. So the insurance industry was being hit with a lot at the same time.
Yep. 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 I got you. So, in terms of like, if you had like a few suggestions for, and you've already touched upon it, right? If you had a few suggestions for anyone listening today, right, about preparation and or evaluation of where they stand, what would you tell our audience?
Have a plan, have an incident response plan, but make sure it works. Run through tabletop exercises and importantly, ensure that everyone who is going to be ultimately responsible in the event of an actual incident is participating in the tabletop exercises. So you want a plan that works, and you want a plan that's available, meaning it's not just on your hard drive, it's printed on your, on your desk and it's available to you. So that'd be the most important recommendation I'd have.
Mhm.
The second important recommendation, again, I might be tooting my own horn here, but I think it's important, is to know who to contact for your outside counsel, because ultimately a company is going to want someone to quarterback an incident and really work in ensuring that they're thinking about litigation and thinking about how to avoid litigation, minimize litigation, and really just prepare in the event of litigation. So you're going to want outside counsel for that. And one who's done, incidents, not just one who's, it's interesting. I mean, you and I talked about this in another conversation, but I started working in cybersecurity back in 2003, right when the term was being coined, and now everyone is a cybersecurity expert. I hate the term expert. I always say I work in, I'm a technology litigator. I work in cybersecurity, but everyone's an expert, but not everyone's an expert. So it's important to realize whether the person you're working with actually has the bona fides such that they've run through or been in support for several incidents. So again, having an outside counsel who knows what they're doing is just critically important. I can't emphasize that enough. And then, third, I discussed this as well, as insurance. That is, if you self-insure, different story, but assuming you're not self-insuring, knowing what your policy says up front and not waiting to be hit with an incident to determine what your policy is. And I would say also now that, to my earlier point about how threat actors have been looking for insurance policies when they attack companies,
Yep.
perhaps not putting your policy everywhere. Perhaps thinking about, segmenting your policy such that it's not like on everyone's computer, that if an attacker were to hit you, that it would be somewhat hard for them to find how much your insurance will cover.
Sure. So All really great points. So, if I could comment and get additional feedback from you. So the plans, uh, interesting thing, and we've talked about this within the context of other crisis response, right? And you sort of alluded to it earlier as well, right? Them being practical, actually useful, right? That's one thing that I find to be really just um, confusing and troubling, frankly, is when you ask folks for, let's see what your plan is, and you get a plan, and then you ask them about the plan, they have no clue. It almost seems like a exercise in futility, right? So I like that point a lot, because it's, again, it can't just be a plan. It's got to be something that could be used. Otherwise, it's useless. On the part of like the legal counsel, obviously, look, there's this is a legal matter. I mean, this turns into a legal matter. There's no if, ands, or buts about that, right? So can you talk a little bit about how hard the work becomes for the attorneys and or the client themselves when they make mistakes without consulting with counsel, and they start doing things on their own, and then they contact you after the fact? How hard is it to undo those? Meaning, how much more difficult does it make the whole process?
Certainly. So after an incident, when outside counsel come in, we work as quarterback, as I said, but we also consider privileged investigations, and some investigations aren't privileged, right? You know, there's been a few court cases recently that suggest that after an incident, if a company is simply trying to get the lights back on, whatever the company does is not going to be privileged because that's for business purpose.
Right.
So there are work streams in place that perhaps you would think a lawyer doesn't need to be a part of. But at the same time, a lawyer can protect what is said or can give advice as to what not to say. So you and I have discussed many a times, but after an incident, the favorite game is the blame game, where everyone's like, oh, if you have only invested the $20 million I'd asked in, this particular infrastructure, we wouldn't have had this incident, right? Those are the worst emails, and they're truly a plaintiff's gift. So we want to control the narrative so no one sends those crazy emails, because they're not true, right? They're just not true.
Right.
So that's challenging. But then to the degree you can have a privileged investigation, figuring out the why or how, doing the due diligence afterwards to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again, that is likely a legal purpose, right? You're doing it for the purpose of preparing in anticipation of litigation.
Right.
And so having someone ready to be like, okay, we don't need these emails here, but what you're doing is not privileged, or we need to run a privileged investigation is critically important. And mistakes are made when people just don't have the diligence to know what to do and not to do, or they start sending emails and blaming. I mean, what you don't want is a chain of emails where everyone's blaming each other.
Right.
That is a disaster, and that has happened. I mean, that has happened sadly to many companies, in which, quite frankly, it's probably not anyone's fault because it was a nation state, right? If China wants to attack you, like, you're toast. There's nothing you can do. You as a company don't have the wherewithal to withstand an attack from a nation state, period, right? And so, these blame games that occur aren't the best. That's not to say people don't make mistakes. Companies don't make mistakes, or people don't make mistakes. I mean, we know that's the case. We know companies haven't invested, or say they're going to have MFA, but then don't actually implement it, or, have policies in place or permissions in place such that anyone can access any like administrator credential. Like that's a nightmare, right? That's not to say every company is perfect, but that's going to come out regardless. But you don't want to come out in the course of an investigation it's just the blame game emails. That's really the worst.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like you're saying, even if it's untrue or not exactly true, it seems to be like a treasure chest for the plaintiff's attorney. So I think that's really helpful. And then the insurance policy thing, um, I hadn't thought about it in the context that you sort of stated it. So you're talking about like internally, right? Making the insurance policy known, or are you referring to like outside? You know what? I think about it. There's people that actually um, advertise their insurance coverage as a sales tool, right? I mean, are you referring all of the above, or something specific?
Yeah, so I mean, what we have witnessed in some of our incidents is the threat actor in the course of negotiating, let's say, a ransomware payment. The client's gonna say, we don't have that money, because generally the client doesn't have like $10 million sitting around or whatever.
Right.
And the threat actor is like, you have insurance coverage. How do they know that?
Right.
Oh, because they captured the policy. Like they found the policy. So that's just a bad situation, right? Like you are essentially, never pay terrorists, never negotiate with terrorists. Wearing my old hat from the federal government. But
Right.
like the terrorists know your game plan. That's just not a good place. So being more thoughtful about who has access to your policies is the way to go. That's not to say that you shouldn't know what the policies are. So, for instance, knowing your premiums or knowing your, like, I'm talking about the dollar value. You
Yep.
don't need to
Yep.
advertise the dollar value, but everyone should know, like, okay, so in the event of an incident, this is what we do, right? We contact this person, we contact that vendor, we do this within so many hours.
Yep.
That's important that everyone knows, but no one, you don't need to necessarily have in everyone's inbox what is the coverage amount.
Right, right, right. No, I mean, I think I mean, you want to talk about like practical advice. I mean, that's just really, really good, sound advice. Um, so I appreciate you coming on the show, and I appreciate you sort of touching upon all these different things. Usually we end the show with takeaways. So I think you just went through the takeaways. I think those are all like brilliant points, and I think that it's a baseline, right? There's obviously more complex and more matters that you have to consider, but at a minimum, these are the things that you want to start thinking about, or um, think about it again and make sure what you have in place makes sense. Anything else that you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say the last thing to watch is, one hot topic that perhaps I don't think I'm the only one who follows, but one that I find very fascinating is the use of forensic vendors. And it used to be that, there'd be an incident and you'd hire a Mandiant or a CrowdStrike or whomever, and they'd come up with this report. And the
Yep.
report would lay out like everything right or wrong.
Right.
And increasingly, and then the company would share the report widely, or they'd give it to their auditors, or give the report to like the president or the board. And increasingly we've seen courts say, okay, well, then you didn't hire this Mandiant or CrowdStrike for a legal purpose. You hired them for a business purpose. And
Hmm.
I just wanted to flag for you and your listeners, like, be thoughtful about why you are hiring these forensic vendors, and be thoughtful about the products you get from them. Because what we've witnessed in a few matters, one in the DC District Court, one in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, and one in the Eastern District of Virginia, is courts have said, nope, these forensic reports are discoverable and they need to be turned over to plaintiff's counsel. And that's really, when the reports are being created, the expectation is that they would never see the light of day outside of the four corners of the company.
Wow.
And and
Yeah.
and we're seeing a change. And so I just caution your clients to just be thoughtful of, okay, if you're hiring a forensic vendor, what is the purpose of their engagement, and what do you really need from them? Do you need a report or not?
So what would be that's really interesting. What would be the downside? I mean, so let's just say are you saying that if they do this long report with a lot of negative items, right? Or not? I mean, what would be the potential downside for the company doing it if they don't think it through?
It's turned over to plaintiffs, right? It becomes discoverable, and the
Mm,
plaintiffs can obtain a discovery. And then the plaintiffs have this report that perhaps isn't well thought out, not in the sense of the managing or CrowdStrike didn't think it out well, but perhaps
right.
has some superlatives that are not necessary,
Sure.
or isn't written in the mind that it would be in the hands of an adversary, right? Like just being thoughtful about what you're putting on paper. I mean, that's sort of the name of the game in our age, right? We're
Yeah.
always thoughtful about what we put online. You got to be thoughtful even about what you put in reports that you think are going to be just close hold.
Yeah.
That's not to say hiding the ball, but I've seen reports in which I just don't think there's careless writing, right? They're making their speculation reports. Like the reports should just be the facts, and sometimes they're just not. And I think everyone wants to be a detective. When there is an incident, everyone wants to know exactly what happened, but sometimes you just don't know.
Yeah.
Or you can, it might be X or it might be Y, but you just don't know. And so taking out the guesswork in reports is really important because, again, the report might not stay within the GC's office.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, to piggyback, I find this point really interesting. So to piggyback, because it really just, I mean, I think most companies are not thinking about this, and so would it make sense to um, obtain a report like this? Does it even make sense for companies to do it direct, or like would it help to go through counsel, or would that make a
So
difference?
you generally go through counsel, period. But having go through counsel, it's not a panacea. It doesn't mean that the report will not then be,
Yeah,
a court won't deem that it wasn't actually for in anticipation of litigation, that it was created for a different purpose. So even having, and that's what we saw with those three cases I mentioned, they had gone through ostensibly legal counsel and outside counsel at that, but the court still determined that they weren't created for anticipation of litigation, and therefore they had to be turned over to the plaintiffs. And so it's not necessarily inviting, ensuring that legal is doing it, but sometimes you just don't need a report, right?
yeah,
Or if you do, just write down the facts. And having, one thing that, I tell my kids or my kids tell me, like, I pay very close attention to what's written down on paper
right.
because you never know who's going to see that. And so, being thoughtful and having even a lawyer review, a report that is supposed to be just the facts and therefore ostensibly not privileged under this new theory of what is privileged and not privileged in the case of forensic reports, having a lawyer is so critically important to ensure that it is indeed just the facts and doesn't have any legal theories associated with it.
Yeah, I think that's just such a critical point. I mean, we talk about that in even our investigative, like whatever we're doing, right? Is whatever we're writing down, again, do it in as few words as possible, stick to the facts, and make it in plain language, right? And whenever you start sort of pontificating on paper, you're asking for trouble, and I just think that's such a good point. Anything else that you wanna bring up? Otherwise, I think this is a great episode. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, I would just say, be careful with your passwords. Like,
Yeah,
they used to say, come up with these creative passwords, and no one really did. I think that's still an important piece of advice, and ensuring that your company is using multi-factor authentication. Those are sort of two easies. But knowing who your outside counsel is, and
yeah,
if Hogan can ever help, I'm happy to, or point you in the right direction if you're looking for someone else.
yeah. Yep. Well, I appreciate you joining me, and we will put Jasmeet's contact information in the description of the podcast. And thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the support, Jasmeet. Thank you so much for joining me. And till next time, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.